Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping straight into the 1982 Turkish constitution.
That's right. We'll be looking at its main features and the fundamental qualities of the state, based on materials from Turkish law talks.
Exactly. And hey, if any questions pop up while you're listening, just drop a comment below the video.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Let's dive in. So, starting with the main features. The first thing to note is that the 1982 Constitution is what's called a casuistic constitution.
Okay, casuistic, that sounds a bit technical. What does that actually tell us about the Constitution itself?
Well, think of it as being very, very detailed, much more so than, say, your typical regulatory constitution you might find elsewhere in continental Europe. It's longer, it spells things out more explicitly.
Right, and why is it like that? Is there a reason for all that detail?
Yeah, the source material suggests it's down to a couple of things. One is providing really extensive explanations about how freedoms can be limited. And the other is this attempt to basically address loads of potential political and social issues right there in the text itself.
Yeah.
Trying to preempt problems, you could say.
So kind of like trying to write the rule book for every possible situation in advance.
Pretty much, yeah. And it's interesting because the earlier 1961 Constitution, that was also considered casuistic.
Ah, okay, so there's a precedent.
There is, but the 1982 version, it's significantly longer, even more detailed. It really leans into that approach.
Got it. So very detailed. What's the next key feature then?
The next one is that it's a rigid constitution.
Rigid. Okay, I think I know what this means generally, but how does it apply here? Harder to change than normal laws.
Exactly that. Amending it requires more complex, more difficult procedures than passing ordinary legislation. It's designed to make changes harder to protect its core elements.
And was this new for 1982?
Well, yes and no. The 1961 Constitution was also rigid, but the 1982 one, it actually increased the rigidity.
Oh, interesting. How did they do that? How did they make it even tougher to amend?
Two main ways, really. First, they increased the number of articles that are completely unchangeable, just off limits for amendment.
Okay, certain fundamentals locked in.
Right. And second, they introduced a whole new stage in the amendment process involving the president.
Ah, okay. What does that involve?
Basically, if the president doesn't approve a constitutional amendment passed by the parliament, the TBMM, they now have the power to submit it to a public referendum.
Wow. Okay, so it doesn't just die, it goes to the people.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
If the president objects, it needs that extra layer of popular approval. It adds a significant hurdle.
Yeah, that definitely sounds more rigid. Okay, so the next point is about a transition period in civilianization of politics. Sounds very specific to the time it was written.
Absolutely. This is tied directly to the context of the military intervention that preceded the Constitution. The provisional articles laid out a very clear path back to civilian rule.
How did that work in practice? What did those articles actually do?
Well, for starters, when the Constitution was approved in the referendum, the head of the military leadership, the president of the National Security Council, automatically became the president of the Republic for a 7-year term. And there was more. After the first general elections were held and the new parliament, the TBMM, convened,
Yes.
the members of that National Security Council, they didn't just disappear. They became members of a new body called the Presidential Council.
Huh. And what was their role?
They served for 6 years, and importantly, they were given basically the same rights and immunities as the elected members of parliament.
So a sort of built-in continuity, integrating the previous leadership into the new system.
Exactly. It was a structured handover. And one more thing on this transition. There was a special rule for constitutional amendments then. If the president sent an amendment back after the parliament's leadership, the Bureau, was formed,
Yeah.
overriding that required a huge majority, 3/4 of the assembly. Again, showing that emphasis on, say, stability and broad agreement during that initial phase.
Right, really locking things down initially. Okay, let's shift gears. The next feature mentioned is a strengthened executive body. How did that play out in what was, at the time, still a parliamentary system?
Good question. So even though it kept the parliamentary structure on paper, the 1982 Constitution deliberately beefed up the executive branch.
How so?
It did it in two ways, mainly. It expanded the powers of the president, and it also elevated the position of the prime minister, making them more dominant within the Council of Ministers.
Okay, so president gets stronger, PM gets stronger.
Yes, but the sources tend to highlight that the president's powers were boosted more significantly. The balance, while strengthening both, tilted towards the president.
And that created some issues, right? Because in a parliamentary system, the president is usually, well, not directly accountable in the same way the government is.
Precisely. You hit on a key point Stahler's raise. strengthening the role of a president who is traditionally seen as politically irresponsible, meaning not directly answerable to Parliament for policy, created this inherent tension.
Like a structural imbalance?
Sort of, yeah. And many argue that this imbalance, this powerful but less accountable presidency within the parliamentary framework, actually uh, sowed the seeds for the eventual move towards a presidential system later on. It highlighted challenges.
Fascinating. Okay, moving on then. The next characteristic described is a less participatory democracy model. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, the idea seems to have been to perhaps depoliticize society to some extent, to channel political activity more strictly through formal structures,
Meaning?
meaning that the primary place for politics should be within the established political parties and the elected state bodies, like Parliament. Less emphasis on grassroots or civil society activism influencing politics directly.
I see. And were there specific rules put in place to encourage this?
Yes, quite a few restrictions were placed on political parties themselves. For instance, they couldn't organize abroad, they couldn't set up side groups like women's or youth branches.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. They also couldn't establish their own foundations, and critically, they were barred from having political or financial connections with a whole range of other organizations like unions, associations, foundations, even professional bodies that had public institution status.
So trying to keep the parties quite self-contained and focus purely on the electoral and parliamentary process.
That seems to have been the aim, yes. Keep politics within those defined channels.
All right. The last main feature listed here is about introducing solutions to deadlocks. This sounds very practical.
It really was.
Yeah.
It looks like the drafters were consciously trying to fix problems that had caused paralysis in the past under the previous constitution. They wanted to make the system work more efficiently.
Makes sense. What were some of these solutions? The first one mentioned is about forming a government or getting a vote of confidence.
Right. So if a government couldn't be formed or if it lost a vote of confidence, the president was given the power, under specific conditions, to basically dissolve parliament and call for new elections.
A way to break the stalemate.
Exactly. A constitutional escape hatch for political deadlock.
Okay. What about electing the president? I recall that caused issues before 1980.
Big issues. Yeah, under the 61 Constitution, there was that infamous 6-month period where they just couldn't elect a president.
Right.
So the 1982 Constitution put in a mechanism. If, after 4 rounds of voting in the parliament, there's still no president elected,
Then what?
then boom, new general elections are held immediately. No more prolonged deadlock in that specific area.
Much more decisive. Were there similar fixes for electing the Speaker of the Parliament?
Yes, similar thinking. They removed the need for an absolute majority of all MPs to elect the Speaker. Instead, the rule became that by the 4th round of voting, whoever gets the most votes wins. Simple plurality.
Again, lowering the bar to prevent gridlock. Makes sense. What about just the day-to-day running of Parliament, getting things voted on?
They addressed the quorum. The minimum number of members needed to be present for business. Under the old system, you needed an absolute majority of all MPs.
Which could be hard to achieve sometimes, I imagine.
Right, so they lowered it significantly. The 1982 Constitution only required 1/3 of the members to be present. That makes it much less likely for work to just grind to a halt because not enough people showed up.
Okay. And I see something about parliamentary groups. They increased the number of MPs needed to form one.
They did. It went from 10 deputies under the 1961 Constitution up to 20.
Why do that?
The thinking seems to have been to limit the power of very small parties. Parliamentary groups get certain rights and procedural advantages, and the concern was that too many small groups could maybe obstruct the legislative process, raising the threshold aimed for more cohesion, perhaps.
Fewer potential veto players, in a way?
Something like that. And finally, a really major structural change. They got rid of the Senate.
Ah, the second chamber of Parliament.
Correct. The 1982 Constitution adopted a unicameral system, just one chamber, the TBMM. The goal was pretty clear. Speed up lawmaking, simplify the process, no need for bills to go through a whole second house.
So, taken together, all these changes, the deadlock breakers, the unicameralism, the quorum rules, they paint a picture of trying to make the system function more smoothly.
Absolutely. And constitutional law experts actually have a term for this kind of approach: rationalized parliamentarism.
Rationalized parliamentarism.
Yeah, it describes constitutional designs that deliberately include mechanisms to prevent blockages and ensure the government can actually govern effectively within a parliamentary framework. The 1982 Constitution is often seen as a strong example of that.
Okay, that covers the main features. Now, let's turn to the fundamental qualities of the state. as laid out in the Constitution. These sound like the core principles.
They absolutely are. These are stated right near the beginning, defining the essential nature of the Turkish Republic according to this constitution.
Let's run through them. First up,
The Republican principle. Foundational, meaning the head of state is elected, not hereditary.
standard for a republic. Next.
The unitary state principle. This emphasizes that Turkey is one indivisible entity, no federalism.
Okay. Then, state respectful of human rights.
Crucial. A commitment by the state to uphold basic human rights and freedoms.
And the next one is very specific. State loyal to Atatürk's nationalism.
Yes, this anchors the state in the principles and ideology associated with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder. It's a defining characteristic.
Followed by state, based on the fundamental principles specified in the preamble. How important is that preamble?
Well, legally, the preamble might not be as directly enforceable as the articles, but it's vital for context. It sets out the philosophy, the history, the spirit behind the Constitution. It guides interpretation,
Got it. Then we have democratic state.
affirming popular sovereignty, elections, representative government, core democratic principles.
And alongside that, secular state.
Yes, the principle of laicite, separation of religion and state affairs, state neutrality towards religions, and freedom of belief.
Okay. Next is social state. What does that entail?
This implies the state has a positive duty to care for the social and economic welfare of its citizens. Think Social Security, public services, that kind of responsibility.
A welfare aspect. Then rule of law state.
Hugely important.
Right.
Rechtsstaat, meaning everyone, including the state itself, is subject to and accountable under the law. No one is above the law.
And the final one listed.
The principle of equality. Everyone is equal before the law. No discrimination allowed on grounds like language, race, sex, political opinion, religion, etc.
So these qualities, taken together, they really define the identity of the Turkish state as envisioned in 1982.
They certainly do. They provide the bedrock values and principles upon which the entire constitutional structure is supposed to rest.
Well, that seems like a comprehensive overview of those key features and fundamental qualities from the 1982 Constitution, drawing on the Turkish law talks material.
Yes, it covers the main points highlighted in that section of the source.
Yeah.
A lot to digest, but it gives a clear picture of the Constitution's design.
It definitely does. Thanks for breaking that down. And that brings us pretty much to the end of this deep dive.
Hope it was useful for everyone listening.
We certainly hope so. Please remember to subscribe to the Turkish Law Talks YouTube channel if you haven't already, and maybe give this video a like if you found it helpful.
And we'll be back with the next lesson covering further aspects soon.
Looking forward to it. Until then, görüşmek üzere.
Görüşmek üzere.